Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Achieving Psychosocial Compliance, Lessons from a Global Metal Mining Company and Navigating Australian Law. My name is Christina, and on behalf of myosh, I am so glad that you could join us all today. We have an exciting and informative session planned for you, where we'll be diving into some key aspects of psychosocial compliance in Australia, which is such an important topic for anyone involved in workplace safety. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our two fantastic presenters. First up, we have Ian from Skodel. Ian is passionate about helping organisations achieve continuous psychosocial compliance with ease, especially for safety leaders and busy professionals who need to manage these requirements without losing focus on their priorities. Next up, we have Martyn Campbell. Now, Martyn is a global leader in the work, health and safety profession. He has a distinguished career, most recently serving as Chief Executive of Safe Work South Australia and as the WHS regulator for South Australia. His experience spans across continents, and he's been instrumental in shaping policies and practices in several different industries. We're so privileged to have you guys here with us today to share your expert perspectives and psychosocial compliance interests, I guess you could say. Now, I want to encourage you all to be as interactive as possible. So please make use of the chat box, the Q&A box. They'll all be open throughout the whole session, so we can throw to you throughout. If you have any questions, we'd love to hear from you. As I mentioned earlier, we are recording today's session, so I will email it out to everybody afterwards. We'll also have it online on our YouTube channel, our website, and send it out within our newsletter as well. So let's get started. Let's unpack the latest developments in psychosocial compliance, such as the Fortescue case study, and let's see if we can help your organisation navigate these important regulations smoothly and successfully. So let's dive in.
Okay, thanks, Christina, and good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are in the world. I'm sitting in a very sunny McLaren Vale in South Australia at the moment, which is a beautiful part of the world. So let me start by sharing my screen and put some slides up. So yeah, look, I spent 6 years as a regulator in South Australia, and 4.5 of those years as the chair of the heads of workplace safety authorities, which was the collective group of regulators around Australia and New Zealand. So the psychosocial safety legislation came in whilst I was in that chair, and had a bit to do with it as part of my role as a regulator, but also as the South Australian representative on the board of South Australia. So it's probably good just to maybe have a little bit of a recap on a few topics first before we get stuck into some of the detail. So look, it's probably fair to say that psychological and psychosocial safety are newer terms that have been bandied around, but these aren't new safety hazards. They've always been in the legislation. It's just no one's really paid that much attention to them over the years. And that was from businesses, workers, and regulators, for that matter. So buried in the health bit of work health and safety is where the psychological safety requirements come from. If you search the Work Health and Safety Act, and I do appreciate there's 9 regulators across the country, so not everyone's working to the Model Act. But if you search that document, it only comes up with two hits, and it doesn't give you any detail. So it was probably fair to say back in the day when I was in the regulator that it didn't really have the visibility that physical injuries had. So there was a decision made to elevate it. So we talk around psychological safety and psychosocial safety, and people use these terms interchangeably, but they are different, and each one of them has its own definition. So if we look at the psychological safety, it's about that willingness to feel safe at work, to share your thoughts, concerns without fear of not to be singled out for retribution because of something that you say or express how you feel. And this really has its roots in psychology, but has been part of the work health and safety regime for a long time. We just haven't really done too much with it. Let me try. Okay. Up there it is. So psychosocial safety is a newer term, but it's a much broader concept, incorporating the environment and behaviors and systems of an organization that support mental and emotional well-being at work. So when I talk to people around what this means to individuals and organizations, it's like, which one of these came first? And it's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation, but when you look at some of the research, the academic research into this is pretty clear that you can start at either end and create a psychosocial framework first, but the research indicates it's much easier to build a psychologically safe workplace first, then move into the psychosocial safety. If people feel comfortable to share their inner thoughts and feelings, it makes creating psychosocial safety that much easier and quicker. So you can start from either point, but what I recommend to the clients that I've been working with is start your psychosocial journey once you've got psychological safety in place. You'll know when that happens because there's a process and a framework you can put in place to do it. Your staff will tell you, and that may come direct or through other feedback. So where does this fit in the current framework? So every organization has a primary duty of care to eliminate hazards in the workplace and risks. So if you can't eliminate them, then you reduce them to a level that's reasonably practicable. And this is your primary duty irrespective of the hazard. We've always really focused on the physical injury stuff, not necessarily the hazards, the psych. So in addition to that primary duty, officers have an additional duty. So this is in section 27 of the Work Health and Safety Act, which says that depending on where you sit in the organizational chart, you may hold an additional duty. That duty is relating to an officer, and the definition of an officer is somebody who makes or contributes towards strategic, significant decisions of an organization or part of it. So your executive group, senior manager group, general managers are probably going to be caught in that definition, but depending on the business you're in, somebody lower down the organizational chart could find themselves in there and have that additional duty. So as an officer, you're expected to demonstrate due diligence to ensure that your organization complies. So you have to make sure that the business you work in is complying with its Section 19 duties. This is the duty of an officer. If you fail in that duty and the business breaches the legislation, there are two separate breaches that a regulator can charge you with. So I'm not going to go through each of them, but you're going to start to get an understanding from these bullet points from the legislation as to what due diligence means and the steps you have to take. So the first one there is just to develop and maintain that psychological and physical health and safety matters. You've got to understand the hazards and risks relating to your business, and that includes the psych hazards. In the last 18 months, nearly every organization I've worked with, senior leaders really have no idea around the psychological or psychosocial risks relevant to them. And even as recent as yesterday, I sat with an executive team at a large professional services organization, and they hadn't even heard of this concept. But the feedback from their staff from a recent survey was pretty appalling. So straight away, when I ask organizations and I ask leaders, tell me what the hazards are relating to your business and what do you understand around psychosocial safety, the vast majority of them can't explain it. If you can't explain it, you don't know it. If you don't know it, you're going to fail at this hurdle instantly. So this is where I start with senior leaders, is really unpacking what their duties are. So when the legislation for psychosocial safety came in, it came in last year, end of 2023 through to 2024, different stages for different states and territories. In South Australia, it enacted on Christmas Day last year, but with the exception of Victoria, I think everyone else has now enacted it. So you've got specific offences within the work health and safety legislation now that addresses not only psychological safety, but psychosocial safety. And the regulators who sit on the board of Safe Work Australia directed Safe Work Australia to prepare some additional information to help businesses understand their duties and what compliance and what good looks like. So Safe Work Australia were instructed to write a code of practice, and in that code of practice, they specified 14 hazards that relate to psychosocial hazards and issues that will ventilate in the workplace. And this is what we have. Now, not every hazard will be relevant to every organization, but it's now sufficiently broad to include not only bad behavior, but also bad systems and structures within an organization. So you'll see that bullying is part of their behavioral, aggression, violence, behavioral, harassment, including sexual harassment, behavioral. But then you also have things like job demands, job control, and the poor physical environment. These are sort of organizational structures and systems which can impact an individual's well-being and adversely affect their mental health.
Martyn, I think this slide, if anybody takes anything away from this slide is probably going to be a key one for a lot of people, especially if they're not 100% sure on exactly what is involved in the whole psychosocial ecosystem. This, to me, once I saw this, I was like, right, this explains what we're looking at and what we're after. And I think it's going to be quite enlightening for everybody to take note of these specific 14 psychosocial hazards. So thank you for this. I'll send, for anybody asking, I'll send a copy of this slide out to everybody after the session today, so everyone's got it as well.
Yeah, look, what I've got, Christina, is it's not going to be in this presentation because we don't have enough time, but I'll include in the slide pack, there's a slide for each one of these 14 hazards.
Amazing.
And in that individual slides, it'll give you some indicators to go and look for as to where things go wrong.
Love it.
But this was really the regulators saying to businesses, you've got to take psychosocial safety seriously. We're going to include it specifically in the law, even though it's always been there. But we're also going to tell you the 14 primary ways that this can happen. So there's really no excuse for not starting the journey. The next stage from here, which I'll hand over to Ian short in a second, and then I'll come back to finish off with the FMG stuff. But once you get this, the next step is to undertake a risk assessment or a gap analysis of your organization. And that's what I've been working with Ian and Skodel over the last sort of 18 months, is to really make it easy for people to get to this stage. So I might zip it there for a sec, Ian, and hand over to you.
Yeah, perfect. So I'll jump in and let's go through an example of one hazard. So what you're looking at here is the risk assessment. And when Martyn talks about how do you show that you've done your due diligence here, this is obviously a really important document here. This outlines the hazards here, but also what controls you have in place now to effectively either eliminate or minimize those here. So let's look into job demands here as an example. So can you see that additional screen now, Christina and Martyn, here that's outlining job demands?
Yeah.
Perfect. So when we go into these hazard details, as we know, you've got to look at these in your own context, but there will be some which are, I think, are fairly generic or relevant across all organizations. And one of those might be, as an example, what's a foreseeable risk here? So one is if we don't manage tasks well or effectively, it could be that some employees end up juggling multiple high priority projects at once with unrealistic deadlines or insufficient support. That's obviously going to potentially increase stress levels and may lead to claims and other things here. So as an example, what do we have in our controls here? And I think this is where a lot of organizations are struggling because they look at the job as just the job essentially. And a lot of this stuff you do already have in place, but it's more about making sure you document it effectively here. So we have fair and effective task management. So that means that tasks are divided and communicated to staff based on skills and capacity as best as possible. So we're not overloading. People have visibility on what everyone else is doing. And that might be a project management tool that we use to do that. So that's an example of where we use that as it might sit on the adjust hierarchy there as a control to minimize the risk of that happening. Now, when we then go to look at scoring that, this is where I think we can, if we can get that consultation data, so understanding from staff's perspective, how prevalent might this be in the organization and what sort of impact might it be having? We can also get that data from, say, work timesheets and understanding if there's a lot of overtime, those sorts of things, even project management tools as well. This is the data that then helps us stand behind a score of this either being a lower risk or potentially the control indicating that the controls may not be working as effectively. So at which point we might look at introducing new controls. Then it's about making sure that we just keep an ordered documentation of all of this here. So some sort of audit log, if you like, that shows that these are being assessed either quarterly or biannually, however frequently you're doing it, and controls are in there as well. To then get a visual of that, we can just see across here the scores, and that's where we want to then look at these hazards and understand where might our priorities lie, in which case we can go in and start adjusting controls there or adding new controls as we see fit. But I think hopefully this provides a good understanding for you of just getting that risk assessment really quite strong and something that you can then stand behind confidently. If a regulator were to come, you can then easily show how you were carrying out your due diligence there. I'll hand back over to Martyn or Christina, actually, just in terms of maybe that poll question could be a good time to look at that.
Not a problem. So everybody, you will notice I've just launched the poll. Which part of managing psychosocial hazards do you feel is the biggest challenge? While everybody's answering that, the way that you present your risk assessments there and the controls and the hierarchy and everything like that is so important, and it's critical, really. But I think the main thing is people are just not using it as a tick the box exercise, that people are actually following through with the actions that are required to fix things and get on top of everything and make sure that when there are issues that they're being resolved and growth is happening.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I saw some participants saying that the controls
is an area people struggle with.
Yeah,
Definitely.
it's an area people struggle with. And yeah, we see that. So we've got a really large bank of controls that are ordered by hierarchy, industry relevance, cost of implementation. That's another part that I think in the poll question we have around leadership buy-in. One of the scary things I think for leadership is thinking that we're going to have to redesign our whole workplace and this is going to be hugely expensive. There are a lot of low-cost, effective controls. It's also that you're doing what's reasonably practicable. So it might not be feasible to, add 5 more support staff because financially it's not possible. That's all obviously accounted for. But I think as an example, we see, say, administrative tasks and other things that are really building up. And a lot of organisations that we work with. And then they've started introducing Killer Task Initiative, which is done as a biannual thing with the team, where they look at, are there any non-essential tasks or tasks that we could feasibly automate that are constantly popping up for us. And that's then showing that, okay, that would sit at the elimination side, and an initiative that's low cost. And a good thing to do as a team. So those are the sorts of things that you can introduce, and it doesn't have to be all-encompassing, hugely expensive. It can be quick wins that have high impact is what we look at.
Absolutely. We some answers to the poll is the majority of people are saying resource constraints, lack of time, budget, or staff. And then closely followed by designing the controls, creating practical, effective psych risk controls. And coming in last, we have survey fatigue, and also no processes. None, sorry, we feel confident about our processes. So it's quite a mixed bag there between the four in the middle. What do you find is the common theme on your end?
If I jump in, the biggest excuse for not doing anything is survey fatigue. I hear it all the time.
Really?
Yeah. So, and for me, the primary issue I see is senior leadership not wanting to hear the results because they know it's bad. So I do a lot of work with boards and executives and senior leadership groups just to say, do you know what, cool your jets a bit. Even if the feedback is horrendous, then at least you know, and that's your starting point. You build forward from there. So depending on what that feedback is and where your starting point is, it could be the lowest bar, it could be you're already pretty mature, but it's about making some continuous improvements. So strategies, and I also say to people, this is not just a safety issue, right? This is probably the first time it's truly a multidisciplinary approach that you need HR, IR, and safety around the table to contribute and resolve it. Under the legislation, you need to consult with your workforce. This is the perfect way to bring your workforce into the solution and in the form of a working group and get them to contribute. So what I've been saying to organizations is I like Skodel because it's relatively inexpensive and it's really easy to use and you get meaningful data quite quickly. It's not like a conventional survey that you do once a year. As a senior leader, I want to know every monthly executive meeting how we're tracking. So what I say to people is step one is to do your risk assessment. That's what Ian has demonstrated on the Skodel platform. You'll start to get your feedback reports to give you an indication as to where you sit on each one of those hazards. So you might see that bullying is 10 times higher than every other hazard in your organization. There's your starter for 10. You can even drill down into the detail to try and determine where in the organization the bullying is occurring. You may be able to determine it's in a division or even a team. But then what you'll do is you'll actually look at other strategies you've got in place from HR, IR, whether they're policies, procedures, training, and then understand where your gaps are. You may not have anything in place, no training. You may have a policy, but no one enforces it. You may actually have a really good mature system where people feel psychologically safe to say what they want. But the important thing I keep saying to executives, and again yesterday, is you've now got the bad news. Get a working group together, let the organization drive it from the bottom up and start implementing some strategies. They might not all work immediately. You might tweak them as you go, and that's okay. I've always been a firm believer of the 80-20 rule. If it's 80% right, give it a crack, bit of action learning methodology, and just tweak it as you go. But the benefit of having Skodel or a tool where you're able to track that information and how your workers feel is that you're getting real-time data that allows you to adjust that strategy every couple of months. And you're not waiting another year for another survey to come. But for people who don't want to start the journey, literally 90% of them, it's survey fatigue. Oh, it's a survey. Oh, people have had too many surveys. They don't want to do another one.
It's not true though. Like you just, if I'm sent a survey from a company that I've purchased something from and there isn't an incentive behind it for me finishing that survey, I get away. I don't care. Whereas I guess the overwhelming incentive for doing, if there was a survey to come out, it's psychosocial metrics, it's that the workplace is going to become a better place. Like it's exciting. But it's getting that point across that we need to really drill.
And I think that's the part that I think tying into that idea of consulting with the workforce, that's where then there's the lack of leadership buy-in potentially in that particular part. So I think understanding where your organisation is really important. If you've never consulted on that, it's good to set up the risk assessment from the perspective of what we currently have in place, understanding, identifying, like I just went through, identifying those foreseeable risks, starting to recognize that you've got a lot of workplaces already have a lot of this stuff in place to address this stuff or eliminate or minimize it as much as possible. And I think that's a helpful frame of mind to be in to then start that journey. It also will inform obviously your consultation efforts once you as a leadership group have thought a bit more in depth about what are the things that are relevant within our organization here.
I think the key word that you're both coming across with, and the most important thing, is to just start.
Yeah.
Make a start. It doesn't matter where you sit on the line of everything. Just start and grow from there. It's that 1% better every day. Like, just make a start. It doesn't have to be perfect.
I would start with that. Yeah, exactly. That psychosocial risk assessment is going to evolve over time as it should, but just make a start on that to try and get it as strong as you possibly can, and consider as many of the foreseeable risks that you can, as well
and
as
get an initial idea of where you're at. You might not even know where your company's at. Like,
exactly. Yeah. And when you go then, say, as Martyn said, if you do it, review it quarterly, there might be things like, okay, there's been redundancies, there's other things like that, which might then you go, okay, it's reasonable to maybe increase the job demand side of things, where it might be a bit of a higher risk now for us, given that we've got less staffing, or those are and just documenting that as reasons as to, you know, what might be happening, and to combat that, we're trying to automate certain tasks or remove non-essential tasks, those sorts of things, that you're just then staying on top of that risk assessment and able to evidence that you're on the journey there is really, really important. So that I would say is just getting that psychosocial risk assessment really set up neatly and in a way that you've got a clear process for then updating it, bringing it into the leadership discussions, talking about it with some real data that's meaningful as well is really important.
And doing it quarterly and not necessarily annually means you're going to come across the different seasons in a year, which means there's different things going on at each end of the year. Like in summer, you've got holidays, you've got the rush towards the end of the year. In winter, you've got the end of financial year. All of those things have a relationship to our psychosocial mentality and everything in between there. So it's so important to not just get one risk assessment done once a year and figure out that that's what it is, and think that that's what it is the whole time. You know, like, doing it more often is going to give you a clearer and more accurate picture.
Yeah. So because I'll share, I've got some slides if you want me to jump along, Christina, to the next section, because it sort of links with what you're saying about if you don't start and you don't get it right. Well, here. So just to refresh, these are the 14 hazards. So there are things that will happen in your organization now which are health and safety breaches, but you've probably always thought of them as HR issues or IR issues. But this now clearly says they're not. They're also a safety issue. So things like sexual harassment at work, bullying, aggression, violence, and so on. So this is a recent case from Victoria, about a Victorian paramedic who was just that grumpy individual that nobody liked to work with. He was rude, disrespectful, wouldn't hold the door open for people. He disrespected women. He's just not a nice person to be around. And we've all sort of come across these people in the past, but there was no sort of violence, touching, other sort of aggression. He just wasn't a nice person. Now, the Ambulance Victoria addressed him through the HR process and gave him a sanction. It was a final written warning, and one of the sanctions was to move him from the ambulance station he was at to another one, which was 350 kilometres away. So he took them to the Fair Work Commission. But the point I'm making here is not the circumstances, it was what the commissioner said in relation to what is bullying. So we sort of tend to think of bullying as like specifically targeting individuals and name calling, talking behind the back, that sort of thing. But it can be generally being rude, has always been like that, doesn't respect women very much, just generally bad behavior. So, but the commissioner said that in his opinion, the behavior was so unreasonable that it creates a risk to health and safety, and that he finds this as bullying behavior. So the commissioner has pretty much set a precedent to say that that level of rudeness and being dissocial and disrespectful would count as bullying behavior. So the benchmark is probably a little bit lower than what we conventionally thought, because certainly when I originally thought of bullying, it was more about a targeted, singled out individual that somebody had a grudge or a dislike against and repeatedly went after that person. But it can just be aimed at everybody because you're just generally grumpy and not nice. So these are the things that the risk assessment would have to capture, and you would have to have some controls in place to address this. Now, are you going to eliminate grumpy, miserable people coming into your workplace? Probably not. But you're going to have some things in place to deal with them when they do turn up. So this is where your HR processes and procedures and the IR procedures will become part of your mitigation controls. You may end up having other things that you'll put in place, and other organizations I've worked with, we've introduced so additions, feedback and performance processes and 360 feedbacks, coaching programs to try and mitigate some of the risks in this. There was another case where a lady was subjected to several years of horrendous abuse and bullying on a construction site, resulting in her winning $1.3 million in compensation. Now, that's potentially because the stress of the work, and stress, remember, is not a medical condition that's claimable. Low levels of stress can be positive. This is when we get to extreme levels of stress where it becomes distress. That's when the stress then causes a medical condition. So anxiety, depression, even potential workplace suicides are captured in these. So this lady got to the point where she couldn't work any further because of the level of depression and anxiety she suffered at the hands of other workers. This one here, the point of this one in Peter Carroll and Carangel was around micromanagement. So this was a person who had the best intentions of the business, and he thought he was doing the best thing for the business, but he was micromanaging his people and second guessing them, controlling to the nth degree. And the court said it doesn't matter what you think you're doing, whether that thought is for the best intention of the business, the fact that you're doing it and affects people is sufficient. So this case here was one that I prosecuted in South Australia. This was construction supervisors who squirted lighter fluid on an apprentice and set him on fire. That was the final event of a series of abusive acts of gluing his toolboxes together, taping him to a chair, locking him in a cabinet, hiding his tools, etc. The point of this was that I charged the organization for breaching the work health and safety legislation, i.e. bullying, and not having a safe system of work. But I also charged the individuals, and we charged the supervisors. So there were supervisors in the room at the time who knew this was going on and did nothing about it. They were the ones that got charged as well. So if you have supervisors in your organization and they see these things happening and do nothing about it, they can potentially be liable as well.
It's exactly what Nicole has just posted in our chat. Bullying and harassment doesn't always have to be proactive. Inaction can achieve the same effect, and it's exactly what you've just said then. It's
100%, definitely.
It's
I had this conversation yesterday with this board owners from a professional services function, and I said, you guys know this is going on and you're doing nothing about it. So if somebody gets injured and somebody claims and the regulator comes calling, you cannot say you didn't know, because you do. that elevates the severity of the breaches. The next two cases are related to a workplace sexual assault, where two separate women were assaulted in two separate locations operated by a care home. The people that did the assaulting had learning difficulties. The point here was that the prosecution for the first organisation occurred, and they were fined, not a huge amount, but they were fined because they pleaded guilty in the first instance. But literally 12 months later, the same thing happened in the same organisation in another premises, because they failed to implement the controls from this prosecution. So in the second prosecution, they had a draft risk plan from the first breach. Nothing got followed through, or very little got followed through. And a similar thing happened again. So they were prosecuted again. Very shortly after this, the chief executive and a senior leadership team from that organization were all moved on. So the workers' comp statistics say it's about 3 to 5 times more expensive than to have a psychological injury than it is to have a physical injury, and it takes 5 to 6 times longer for a worker to get back to work if they ever come back. So you don't need too many psychological or psychosocial claims to significantly impact your workers' comp levies. So another client I had recently was a tier 1 building company. They had their first psychosocial injury claim accepted. Their premiums jumped $500,000 overnight. So when boards and senior executives ask me why they should do this, well, firstly, it's the law, and it's the right thing to do to help to protect your workforce. But secondly, like, if you don't do it, it's going to impact your reputation in your business, and it'll hit your bottom line. Because 2 or 3 of these claims, and it attracts the attention of the workers' compensation regulator, which means it's going to attract the attention of the safety regulator, and that's when they'll come knocking.
It's a smart business decision, not only financially, like you've just said, but emotionally and mentally and physically as well. Like, it's stupid not to.
Yeah. So attrition rates and exit interviews are a great tool to help monitor this. The company I was speaking to yesterday had no idea what their attrition rate was till we made some inquiries, and it was about 37% a year. So a third of the workforce left every year, and they didn't do exit interviews because they didn't care. But a lot of the anecdotal feedback was all related to psychosocial breaches. So you can get the information internally if you look in the right spot for it. So when it comes to prosecutions, not every breach results in a prosecution. So under the Work Health and Safety Act, there is an alternative to that, which is where we get to the FMG. So this is still going through with WorkSafe WA. And I, as a regulator, I accepted a number of these, but there's a bit of thinking and decision-making that goes behind them. So an enforceable undertaking is a written agreement that's legally binding that is an alternative to being prosecuted. So the EU has to come from the PCBU. There is a mechanism in the law for a court to issue an EU, but generally most come before charges are laid. So an EU's got to come from the business. It can only be accepted by the regulator, and in the legislation, the regulators are named. It's generally the head of the agency. In this case, it was Commissioner Sally North from WorkSafe WA. But when you get these, the legislation says you have to look at the workplace, community, and industry benefits. And they were the 3 things that I used to focus on heavily. And I would imagine Sally would have done exactly the same thing in this situation here. So the one caveat with these is that in the Work Health and Safety Act, you've got 3 categories of breaches, 1, 2, and 3. Category 1 breach is the most serious. It's where there's an element of recklessness. So what this really means is that there's a risk to work to health and safety, but you go ahead and do that anyway, and you're reckless as to whether somebody's hurt or dies. It's the most serious charge. If the circumstances fit a Category 1 offence, a regulator will never practically accept an enforceable undertaking. But for Category 2 and 3, the minor ones, most definitely they are. Now, there are some benefits for a business to ask for an enforceable undertaking. When I was a regulator, I was acutely aware that when you take people to court and they are fined, that money doesn't go back to the regulator, and it doesn't go to workers, and it doesn't go to workers' families. It goes into general revenue in the government treasury. So enforceable undertakings are a really good tool to reinvest back into your business and back into worker safety. So I used to encourage people to do that all the time. So when we look at FMG's EU and we understand what it's for, so for those that hadn't sort of looked at it too closely, WorkSafe WA were investigating Fortescue Metal for several claims of sexual harassment at 3 different mine sites in WA. So that was at Christmas Creek, the Solomons, and Cloudbreak mines. Now, each of those breaches generally has a penalty for a business, or maximum penalty for a business, of about $50,000 per breach. So the WA regulator was investigating 34 breaches of the legislation. So for the maths geniuses amongst us, that's 1.7 million. I'm not that, so I had to use a calculator. Now, 1.7 million if they were convicted and if they were given the maximum penalty. If you plead guilty on the first hearing, most courts will give you a deduction. And in South Australia, that deduction is 40%. So that brings the 1.7 million down to just over $1 million in penalties. So FMG would have made a strategic decision to enter into this EU, and they would have looked at what that breach was for. Now, the breach that they were going to be charged with was a breach of Section 171 of the Work Health and Safety Act. So this is the power that an inspector has to request documents and when they are on a mine site or when they're on a workplace. So there are 2 powers that inspectors generally exercise in order to get information. If they're on a workplace, they use Section 171. If they've left the workplace but then need some other information, they use Section 155. But both sections are around getting information out of the business. And Fortescue refused or failed to provide the information that was requested. So when you do that, every time you request it, it's a breach. And WA were looking at prosecuting. So before the prosecution was laid, FMG submitted an application for enforceable undertaking, and that's what we are seeing today. So the value of the undertaking was pretty significant. It was 1.4 million in total. Well, let's skip through that. But yeah, 1.4 million in total for their undertaking. So there were 10 terms in that undertaking, which is effectively like a contract, but it's a legal document that's binding, and it has to be accepted by the regulator, and the regulator has to consider those 3 elements.
Are they made public?
Yeah, so generally they're on the regulator's websites. So once the regulator accepts them, then they're generally published on the regulator's website. There's a few other places that push them out as well, but you can jump onto any of the regulators' websites and have a look.
So it's not like if they were to go to through the court system, whereas that gets all published and it's public, this too is also public and published as well. Like you're not skipping that thing, which would be a main concern for people, for businesses, I assume. They would prefer to it not be public.
Yeah. So this is part of the negotiation or discussion phase before a regulator signs it, is that these have to be made public, and there's got to be some community benefit aspect to the EU. So I used to go back to organisations and say to them, look, the legislation allows you to apply for an EU. I'm open to an EU in lieu of being prosecuted. There are benefits to the regulator for not going through a full investigation and through the court process. It's really expensive for a start, and there's always the chance you might not win. But so I used to look at it always, my focus was always on the benefit to the worker. So how can I make it more impactful and better for the worker? And if that meant we had to charge people and go to court, then that's what we did. But if we could reinvest money back into an organization or something that made people's lives better, then that's what I would prefer. I'd much rather do that than give it to the treasurer. They'd only waste it half the time anyway. So I would much rather reinvest in a business's workplace safety than allow it to be spent on something else. So what FMG have done when you read through these 10 strategies is they've incorporated the other reports into the mining industry, such as the Enough is Enough report. And I'm sure you can read through here and get the flavour from the Sex Discrimination Commissioner's Respect at Work report. But they put 10 strategies in place which addresses sexual harassment not only in FMG, but for the benefit of the mining community and the broader community as well. So the regulator would have considered each one of these against the 3 criteria I mentioned at the start to determine whether or not she was happy with what they'd put forward. So EUs are not a cheap option. They're not an easy way out. The value of an EU should be in the area of where a potential fine would be. So you're not getting away lightly, and it's not a cheap option. You're better off reinvesting 1.4 million back into your business than giving it to the...
I was going to say the benefit, though, regardless of the discrepancy in the cost, is that the future of your company is going to be 10 times better.
Yeah. So what they've done here is pretty common. They've got some education programs, training programs for their site, for contractors. This is all about making sure the contractors live and breathe the values that the organisation has, so everyone's working to the same standard. They've got some programs in there around executives. This is critical. If your executives don't get it and they're not interested, that'll flow down the rest of the organisation. Executives have to take a lead, and they have to walk and talk this for it to be successful. This will be an interesting document which is going to be made publicly available for everyone, but looking at current reports, tools, and other recommendations around the psychosocial risk space. So this should be a document which we can go to look at what's available and potentially what's worked well. Just as a shameless plug, I chair the National Psychosocial Safety Network, which is a collective group of people to do just this. I chair an expert advisory panel of academics, and it's all about transitioning research into practical strategies and solutions. So there are some places you can go to get it.
We'll provide links to all of those things in the email after today as well.
Yeah. This is one that's is intended to hit the broadest from the community aspect. So this is aimed at not just the FMG workers, but outside of that. And so advertising. Now this is an interesting, where's the next one, sorry. No, this is the interesting one. So this is a psychosocial assurance standard, which is pretty much going to be the document that benchmarks what good looks like for FMG, and it's what everyone else who works for the organization should be. So I think these are quite a good tool if they're done properly and they're managed, because this effectively says an organization is not going to do business with us unless they reach this standard. And this is what I keep saying to leaders in other organizations, is if you set the beat of the drum, and if it's on your radar, it's on everyone else's radar. If you walk the talk, people will follow you. But then you set the standard by not engaging with people or organizations who don't meet your standards. And that's about community driving standards up. So we'll see how that one comes back with. And then this is the biggest investment. This is going to be a security and duress app, which they're extending beyond the mine into the more broader community. So it's going to be freely available on smartphones for people to flag and raise some issues. I'm not exactly sure how it's going to work, but they'll work through the regulator. So we'll work with the regulator to look at what good looks like. But pretty much what will happen is once the regulator is satisfied with the implementation plan for each of these, they'll endorse it and they'll oversee the implementation by FMG and make sure that these are actually followed through, put in place, and do work as they're intended to do. So I'll shut up there.
That's incredible. I think it's such a wider beneficial way of dealing with issues, because not only are we not seeing large companies get away with things by just paying off their issues, they're actually making change, and they're benefiting the industries on a broader spectrum. It's just, I think that's so admirable that the regulators are putting that into place. I never knew that was a thing before today. So that's something I've definitely learned. That's incredible.
They are a really good tool, and they weren't widely used when I first went to the regulator, like 2017. But as they're becoming more visible, they're growing in popularity. And I think if regulators actively engage with businesses to help them develop it, then you get good outcomes. And for me, good outcomes is all about reinvesting back into safety and making it better for work.
Just actionable penalties. Like it's a no-brainer, isn't it?
Yeah. So, and I think for me, I've been connected with Skodel for a while now, but I think for me, working with companies around Australia and overseas, it's all about managing risk. That's what safety is about, and we shouldn't be treating the psych stuff any differently to physical.
No.
So in physical injuries, we're pretty comfortable doing risk assessments. Apply the same methodologies and principles to this as you would with that. Your controls are going to be a little bit different, but if you work with your HR, IR, and your safety teams collaboratively with your workforce, you'll get some pretty good solutions. And for me, like one of the best things about Skodel is the platform's built around those 14 hazards, and it gives your workers a means to record how they are feeling and experiencing work and relationships and systems and organizations against those hazards. And then every 2 or 3 months, you get a report which shows how you're tracking. And as an executive group, that's gold, because you're able to then tweak and understand your risk profile, which links into demonstrating due diligence, which links into discharging your duty as an officer.
Yeah, and it's so important to action change before it's too late as well. So the more regularly you're receiving updates, the more beneficial it's going to be to everybody in the company, not just the leaders. So
yeah, and as I said yesterday, you don't want to be responsible for somebody being so depressed or anxious they can't work again because of the way you or others were operated in your business. And for me, that's the driver of why I do this.
Absolutely.
Why I get up and do it.
People don't work because not often people are working because they love their job and they love doing it all day, every day. They work because we need an income, and they work because they need to survive and live. And if you're going to work and it's driving you to a place of not wanting to survive or not wanting to live, what on earth is happening? What can we do to change that? And that's what you guys are doing, and it's just incredible. Any last words, Ian?
No, I just think there was one question around what sort of documents I think that popped up. What sort of documents the regulator would have been looking for in that?
I think that was around the EU.
Yeah, the EU. So Martyn, maybe from your regulator experience, what sort of documents you look for when you go in and inspect a workplace?
So the regulators won't necessarily look for documents. I'm not a huge fan of too much paper, because paper doesn't stop people getting hurt, but you do need a bit. So the regulator will ask you, have you identified the hazards relating to the work you do? Have you risk assessed them? Have you applied some controls that either eliminate or reduce them to a level that's reasonably practicable? And the last one, which is what people always forget, is, are they working? So risk assessment, controls, consult your workforce, put your controls in place, tweak them as you go along, and check that they're working. If you can demonstrate that to a regulator, you're compliant.
And maintain it as well.
And maintain it. And the case of Safe Work New South Wales and Wollongong Glass is the precedent to say that your safety management system doesn't have to be documented. So sometimes less is more. So we record things and document things because it's easy to provide evidence, but it's quite easy then to have too many documents that it becomes bureaucratic. So the case of Wollongong Glass is a case to say you don't have to document a safety management system, but it's helpful to document some things. Just don't drown in documentation, because for so many times as a regulator, I've used people's own documents against them, because you write things down and don't follow it, then you got no excuse.
It's because it all becomes a tick and flick exercise. And like Ian said earlier, you need to ensure that what you're doing is practical for you and your company and works within you and your company, and something that it's not going to be seen as a chore, or it's not going to be seen as something that's too hard to do or too hard to action. It needs to work in with you, which is why it's important that the regulators are flexible in what documents they actually see and what they use.
And just look at the comments, the chat, Fiona's dead right. Like, controls is the hardest area. The risk assessment stuff's easy, but the controls is hard. But don't let that paralyze you. Start implementing some. If you get stuck, there's lots of places and people you can go for some help and guidance. And 80-20 rule. Get started, tweak it as you go along.
I love that so much. And again, I think collaboration is key, and just start. If you take anything from today, collaborate and start. It's as simple as that. And just be
Go and ask your workers. Go and ask your workers who the bullies are, who the arseholes are, where the issues are, and they'll tell you every time, because they deal with them every day. Exactly.
It's horrible. There's nothing worse. Well, thank you guys. Thank you so much. I hope everybody enjoyed today's chat as much as I did. It was wonderful to learn so much from you both. As I mentioned, I've recorded this today, so I will email it out to everybody that has registered. It'll also be available on our YouTube channel, our website, and as a podcast wherever you listen to those. I'll also email out some of the links that were mentioned in today's session as well. So again, Ian, Martyn, thank you so much. And we look forward to chatting again soon.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Have a great weekend, everyone.
See you later.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.